Testing 1 2. Testing the microphone 1 2 3 4.
Good afternoon. I'd like to begin by recognizing Professor Safwan Masri of the Office of Columbia Global Centers, which he leads, and for helping to co-sponsor this event. Safwan, who is enjoying the recent publication of his well-received book, Tunisia, an Arab Anomaly, is going to serve as the moderator of the question and answer session that will follow the High Commissioner's remarks. Our guest, Mr. Zeid Ra'ad Al Hussein, became the UN's High Commissioner for Human Rights in 2014. During the past 3 years, he has confronted perpetrators of civil rights abuses at all levels of society and tackled a series of issues that, when taken together, describe the global challenges that define our time. Mr. Zeid has denounced ISIS for the slaughter of civilians in Iraq and Syria. He has condemned the leaders of right-wing nationalist movements in Europe and elsewhere when they incite bigotry and provoke hate crimes. And closer to home, he has demanded that those responsible for torture by the CIA be held criminally liable, and has rebuked President Trump for his comments following the violent protests in Charlottesville, Virginia. It comes as no surprise to those who know Mr. Zeid and are familiar with his career that for the past 3 years he has so energetically embraced the opportunity to battle human rights violators. In 2002, Mr. Zeid was deeply involved in advocating for and then negotiating the creation of the International Criminal Court. He recognized the fundamental truth that when crimes against humanity are committed, genocide, war crimes, and so on, individuals must be held accountable if society's collective sense of justice is to be preserved. He has served as president of the UN Security Council during the time that Jordan was a council member, and he has also been president of the International Criminal Court's governing body. In 2004, Secretary General Kofi Annan asked Mr. Zeid to turn his attention and his talents to reports of sexual violence by UN peacekeepers stationed in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Mr. Zeid's investigation concluded not only with the extensive documentation of abuse, but also with the condemnation of the UN peacekeeping department's earlier failure to punish perpetrators. The fact that he showed no fear, nor gave any favor to fellow UN officials, conveyed an important and lasting message. The High Commissioner has also ably represented his home nation, Jordan, first as permanent representative to the United Nations and later as Jordan's ambassador to the United States. The High Commissioner was educated at Johns Hopkins and the University of Cambridge. While working for the United Nations during the Balkan Wars in the 1990s, he came face to face with horrifying atrocities, an experience that forever shaped his view of the world and left him with the determination to devote his life to confronting such evil. As you can see, Mr. Zeid's time as head of the High Commission on Human Rights has very much been a continuation of his previous public and diplomatic service, always taking on the most difficult challenges of the moment with integrity and courage. And I can say personally, I have read many of the High Commissioner's statements. They are beautifully and powerfully written. And it takes a very special person to play this role, somebody who has to be prepared to deal in the depths of human depravity and suffering, and also retain a sense of hope and idealism. And Mr. Zeid has all of that. The title of the High Commissioner's talk is The State of Human Rights in the World Today. Please join me in welcoming the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, Mr. Zeid.
Thank you, President Bollinger. Thank you, Lee, for that most generous and warm welcome. When you have teenage children, it's always lovely to feel appreciated. The other day, my 14-year-old walked into our kitchen, not far away from here. I live in Harlem, and she was on her way to school, and she had a backpack on, and I was sitting there reading the newspaper. And she looked at me rather dismissively, and in a manner that only a 14-year-old girl can convey to her father, she said to me, "So how long are you going to remain a gray UN bureaucrat?" Oh, what a stinging comment that was. I'm honored to be here and have always admired your outstanding leadership, Lee, both intellectual and policy-wise. Your determination to deepen and broaden the mark left by this great university as it goes about solving the mysteries and the problems challenging all of us today, the work of the global centers led by my great and distinguished friend Safwan, devoted to that aim, is highly significant and recognized by all of us. I also feel quite at home here. While I never studied in Columbia, I was taught political theory by Michael Doyle some 32 years ago, and I still can't believe I got a rotten grade from him once for my paper on Kant's perpetual peace. And I mean, what was he thinking? He probably was thinking, what a rubbish paper. I think that's probably what he was thinking. Michael later became a senior colleague within the UN, and I loved bumping into my former professor and seeing a friend steeped in theory apply it cleverly when decoding the cipher that is today's world. I'm also truly delighted to see my friend, old friend, Elazar Barkan, a man from whom I learned an immense amount. Elazar, I mentioned to you this earlier. I miss our long discussions that we used to have on memory, memorialization, and reconciliation, and your work is now more important, more needed than ever before. Finally, I salute you, Lee, not only for your scholarship and personal devotion to the study of the First Amendment, but also for making Columbia, among the universities of the first rank, a locus for the study of human rights, with the creation of the Columbia Global Freedom of Expression, the Institute for the Study of Human Rights, the Global Policy Institute, and the Human Rights Clinic at the law school. And having Sarah Cleveland as a very prominent member of the Human Rights Committee, and Agnes Kalamard as the courageous UN Special Rapporteur for extrajudicial killings, also distinguishes Columbia from all other major universities. So it is sometimes difficult to see extremes and then fathom the extent to which they belong to the same canvas of human experience. But this is how it was for me recently. Within an 8-day span, I went from being in Silicon Valley, where, and I find this simply staggering, digital engineers using artificial intelligence are reading the human mind, to visiting Libya, a country so broken and dangerous, it is practically the only country in which the UN has no permanent presence. Put another way, I had to transition mentally from wading in a festival of creativity to coping in a country teeming with hundreds of armed groups committing the most horrific human rights violations, where thousands of people, mainly migrants, are subjected to slavery, trafficking, and sexual violence, and almost anyone may be the object of arbitrary violence. Peering into the future 1 minute, and then landing in some distant past of humanity the next. Mind blown, as my 16-year-old son would say. And yet, my office and I are very relevant to both contexts. Universal human rights law needs to be applied in both these situations. Both demand the anchoring force of principles for conscience and practical guidance, a deeper consciousness of rights. That is my job. There you have it in a nutshell, my mandate as High Commissioner. But it is your job too, because this is what I think universities are here to do, to help people grasp what is happening around them and to develop an understanding of what can and must be changed and how to do it. Human rights faces a stress test today. The kaleidoscope of global politics is shifting, and the approach which seems to be in the ascendant is a blinkered, blind alley vision of domination, nationalism, and walled-in sovereignty. This is your future we are talking about, and we need to turn this around because we believe cooperation is possible. An end to extreme poverty, hunger, and many other human-made human rights violations is entirely within reach. But world leaders seem increasingly to be turning away from multilateral institutions, making it possible or impossible to work up solutions. Libya is one extreme example. A disastrous human rights landscape, the lawless expression of conflict and destruction. And yet, even in this incredibly bleak setting, we can take steps to improve the situation, and I went there to discuss that. We believe deeply the actions of my office, along with the efforts of others, like UN Special Rapporteurs and treaty bodies, can help pull societies back from open violence, and we can, over time, assist in bringing about peace. And I believe our work done in Colombia, to take one example, demonstrates that. So in Libya, as elsewhere, in an alarming and growing number of countries, in fact, we will keep trying to push back against persistent human rights violations. But new challenges have also entered the scene at another extreme, and this is what I would like to discuss in greater depth with you today, because digital technology is swiftly revolutionizing every aspect of human life, and it introduces complexities for human rights that also demand our urgent attention. No medium in human history has ever been as intimate or ubiquitous as the internet. It is present at our fingertips whenever we call. A smartphone is like Aladdin's lamp or Aladdin's lamp. You pull it out of your pocket and rub it, and wherever you are, the genie appears. On average, according to some research I recently read, American smartphone users tap, click, and swipe their phones 2,617 times every day. In 1970, Marshall McLuhan, paraphrasing Einstein, pointed out that, and I quote, "We live invested in an electrical information environment that is quite as imperceptible as to us as water is to fish." Well, you certainly live in it. You are the digital natives. I am a digital immigrant, still a bit of an outsider, an imperfect fish. And from this slightly awkward vantage point, I've become an avid observer of the online environment. I see that the digital universe offers us amazing possibilities for human rights work. We already use satellite imagery and encrypted communications to ensure better monitoring, investigation, and analysis of human rights violations in places where the authorities refuse to give us access. New data streams have been used to track and interrupt human trafficking and exploitation, and have tracked modern slavery in supply chains. Social media has become a significant source of evidence, including witness testimony and video of human rights violations, although adequate confirmation of this kind of evidence can be a challenge. Use of the internet can also massively boost public participation and social justice. Over 1 million people participated online in consultations leading to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, to take one example very close to us. Last year, a study by PwC found that bringing internet access to the 1.4 billion people in the world who do not have it would vastly increase global economic output and raise 500 million people out of poverty. The main barrier they found was not lack of infrastructure, but lack of money. People still cannot afford to be online. We need more measures to resolve this digital deficit. States' obligations to protect the free and open internet derive from fundamental and universally accepted human rights, most obviously freedom of expression and the right to privacy. Internet connectivity has also become essential to freedom of association, full participation in social, cultural, and political life, and the right to development. The UN General Assembly and the Human Rights Council have clearly affirmed that rights which we hold to be inalienable offline must also be protected online. But a growing wave of copycat measures by states sharply undermines human rights and clearly threatens the existence of a free and open internet. Shutdowns, cutting internet connectivity or blocking temporarily or permanently specific sites are twinned with crackdowns, which use digital surveillance to track and target activists and human rights defenders. In China, the Great Firewall essentially restricts access to all but the government-approved websites. In Egypt, more than 400 websites operated by media outlets and human rights NGOs have been blocked. In 2016, according to the NGO Freedom House, authorities in 38 countries arrested people because they published, shared, or liked social media posts. Attacks by states on online freedom and the use of surveillance to target and harm human rights defenders are an acute concern to my office. Any measures to restrict access to, block, or remove content from internet sites on the part of governments wielding counterterrorism policies or for any other reason must comply with international human rights standards. They should be proportionate to the threat, demonstrably necessary in their most precise details, as minimally restrictive as possible, supervised by public bodies, and defined by laws which derive from public consultation. Attempts to censor and exploit the digital space for political purposes put private companies under enormous pressure. It cannot have escaped you that even as the digital space has expanded, it has also become more narrow, dominated by a handful of corporations, Facebook, Google, Microsoft, and so on. Governments increasingly demand these businesses become regulators of content. National officials have threatened to close down the services of companies unless given direct access to communications traffic. Others have tapped fiber optic cables for surveillance purposes. Governments have also used surveillance of telecommunications networks to target political opponents and dissidents. They have enacted legal requirements to take down or block content, and in other cases have demanded that content be removed, even when it is not illegal under domestic law. Compliance with such orders, or the decision not to comply with them, requires assessments of context and knowledge of both national and international law, and this is knowledge that many companies admit they do not grasp. However, when a company supplies data to a state in contravention of the right to privacy under international law, or when a company provides mass surveillance technology or equipment to states without adequate safeguards in place, or where the information is intended for a use in violation of human rights, that company clearly risks becoming complicit in human rights abuses. And despite our sympathy for greater regulation of online content, we need to be wary of how such measures will play in places where the actual commitment to free speech and open civic space is much more limited. As with measures taken to counter terrorism, we know repressive governments will gladly take whatever space we give them to block speech and punish those who dare to use the digital space to challenge their policies. We do need to act, but a sledgehammer approach will do enormous harm. Companies should therefore avoid being either exploited by governments or becoming vehicles for the fanning of violent extremism. Indeed, in the context of the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism and other initiatives, Facebook, Microsoft, Twitter, and YouTube aim to better address a number of difficult questions regarding freedom of expression in the context of violent extremism. They know they are becoming conduits for forms of expression which incite hatred and violence, as well as specific and despicable forms of harassment and online stalking of women in particular, and they want to know how to stop it. All of these areas that clearly cry out for much more practical guidance on rights, including from my office, and we will continue to try to step up our efforts to provide advice on measures that can and must be taken in line with human rights. Big data is another issue which raises disturbing human rights concerns. An authority on the digital space told me only last week, privacy is dead. What is at stake now is the integrity of the data collected. Corporate surveillance and the monetization of the personal data of everyone who uses the internet is a distinct issue from state surveillance of human rights activists. In both cases, however, serious questions arise over the extent to which individuals are aware of what data they are sharing, how, with whom, and to what use they will be put. Data is frequently being harvested and resold to ends for which individuals have not been consulted or consented. Complex algorithms can also mask discrimination and, wittingly or not, deepen inequalities. Traveling more deeply into the digital labyrinth, we arrive at artificial intelligence, mind-boggling techniques whose rapid development may have immense implications for our human rights. Digital automations such as blockchains will certainly make many processes and decisions smarter, faster, and cheaper. But as we have already seen with the loss of jobs in manufacturing, it will also raise issues of justice, discrimination, privacy, accountability, and redress. And human rights has a critical role here if we can find a way to integrate and adapt to the challenging tech environment, ensuring that formal education of specialists in IT or robotics is grounded in a fundamental awareness of human rights imperatives and building a greater consciousness of critical ethical principles among today's coders and developers around the world is an immense undertaking. There is also a need for strengthened regulatory frameworks, but the complexity of the technology and algorithms and the high speed of change require better and new tools to ensure effective accountability. And these are urgent tasks, whether we are talking about the use of machines to diagnose illness, control of automobiles, or sense movement at borders, or the use of algorithms to recommend criminal sentences, triage medical care, screen job candidates, or determine credit ratings. It is essential that human rights be baked into these systems from their inception. There is today a critical window of opportunity to build fundamental human rights and values into these future technologies and ecosystems before their mass adoption. I have not yet mentioned weaponry. New technologies have already led to both development and deployment of increasingly autonomous weapon systems whose use and rapid proliferation pose alarming risks to human life and rights. Armed drones have been increasingly used for targeted killings, raising profound ethical, legal, and moral questions, and many more states and non-state actors are seeking to acquire these technologies. Fully autonomous weapons, the so-called killer robots, eventually will be able to identify and fire on targets without any meaningful human intervention, giving them the power to determine when to take human life. And I find this really quite disturbing in the extreme. Cyber warfare techniques mean that states and state-sponsored hackers are now capable of attacking the computer systems of hospitals, dams, power stations, or aircraft control systems, depriving civilians of essential services. We believe international humanitarian law applies to digital warfare techniques, but given the current widespread indifference to violations of the Geneva Conventions, including bombardment of medical centers in Syria, Yemen, and elsewhere, there's every reason to be skeptical about whether states engaged in cyber warfare will conform with the law. These issues pose very real ethical, moral, and legal challenges for me, for you, and for future generations. There is a pressing need for compliance with the current legal frameworks and for guidance on whether they ought to be supplemented to ensure that people's human rights are kept at the forefront as the digital universe continues to move forward. Progress cannot mean that the fundamental freedoms and rights, which are inalienable for every human being, are eroded and cast aside, such as freedom of expression, opinion, and information, equal rights before the law, the right to privacy, and to life, liberty, and security. With very limited resources, my office will be doing its best to issue guidance on many of these issues, but we also need a constituency of people who will back us, people who are informed, who are thoughtful, and who care. And this is where you come in. We need you. We need your concern. We need your intelligence. We need you to advise us and to support us. I am reminded of Niels Bohr, the Nobel-winning Danish physicist and father of quantum physics. In December of 1943, Bohr went to Los Alamos, where the Manhattan Project had embarked on building a completely new world-changing weapon. At 57, he was the oldest scientist present. The average age of participants in the Manhattan Project was 29. And although he did add some marginal technical expertise to the project, his main contribution was to span the huge gap between the team's growing technological prowess and a needed thoughtfulness regarding the looming existence of nuclear weaponry. Bohr warned of a runaway arms race that would drain resources away from beneficial outcomes and focus them towards destruction. He inspired the physicists to think about the consequences of their work and laid down the seeds of what would become the International Atomic Energy Agency and an effort at international control of nuclear proliferation. Today, I believe we need to think much more deeply about the ethical implications of what we do. In places like Yemen, the growing deadlock between rival political blocs is allowing conflicts to deepen in horror and in magnitude. Without a sense of common purpose, a desire for working together on the basis of universally held principles, the mayhem cannot be contained. It has, and it will continue to spread. We need to return to the question of why the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was drawn up in the aftermath of the Second World War. What was it there for? And why should we still adhere to it? Because the alternative has been tried, and it was catastrophic. And because human equality and dignity are the inalienable rights of every human being, recognizing and fulfilling those rights, not partially as has been the case, but completely, builds peace for all of us. The digital universe, too, must be made fit for human purposes. People's rights and needs must be placed at the center of this complex, thrilling, and sometimes frightening new world. I welcome your thoughts on how we can achieve this together, and I thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Zaid. Can you hear me? Not sure if the
Microphone.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Zaid, for those very insightful observations. Despite what your children might say, I think it's fair to say that you are bringing the definition of human rights into the new age. And it's especially thought-provoking to look at the notion of the internet and what it has done, from both sides of it, free and open access to the internet being a human right, and the protection of human rights through online platforms, and the sort of the struggle to ensure that human rights are not abused by the private sector and other means is definitely something that you bring to this discussion in a wonderful way. I'm going to ask you just a couple of quick questions, and then we're going to open up the floor. So my first question is, you're a fellow Jordanian. We're both Jordanians. We both are Harlemites, I guess, if the word, and globalists. But you're a royal. You're a member of the royal family of Jordan. So how do you get away lecturing the world as an Arab royal, on human rights? I mean, the Arab world in general is not particularly known and is not used as a benchmark for advanced human rights implementation.
First of all, Safwan, can I begin by saying I'm mortified at the fact that I'm sitting on a high stage, because when thinking of what my daughter said about me being grey bureaucrat, I decided to wear polka dot socks this morning. And then I thought to myself, when Lee was introducing me, how on earth is anyone going to take me seriously sitting here with these polka dot socks? Yeah, it is amusing almost when you travel the world and people react in that way, thinking, who do you think you are, lecturing to us about human rights and the obligations, and given your background and where you come from? But I think it's precisely the point that human rights defenders try to articulate when explaining to others that you don't judge people on the basis of nationality, ethnicity, race, sexual orientation, or any other criteria. You judge them on conduct. You judge them on the long history they have had over particular issues. What I think separates human rights defenders from others, and we have to be careful here, because we don't want to come across as being righteous, overly pious. We don't have all the answers. We make mistakes. But I think what works within us is a recognition that all of us, if we don't fight an internal battle constantly to strip away stereotypes, to arrive quickly at conclusions about others, we can become bigoted, chauvinistic, racist, and it's that qualification that I think separates those who are more consciously concerned with human rights than others. So I don't claim to have any special qualification other than in my early career, I served in the former Yugoslavia, as Lee mentioned. And for me, it completely changed the way I viewed things. And I early on felt that one had to be very vocal about populism, because I saw the consequences of it in Croatia and in Bosnia 20 years ago. And it was so cruel, so bitter, people suffered so grievously, that it's almost beyond one's imagination when one sees these demonstrations in Poland, as we saw 2 days ago, or sees what's happening in Central Europe, the xenophobia, racism, anti-Semitism. I mean, has memory faded so quickly to the point that we can embrace patterns of human experience that we thought we had done away with, and they're still there. And that's why I said I strongly believe that Al-Azhar's work on memorialization and memory and reconciliation is more needed now than ever before.
By the way, I mean, while I ask the second question, maybe those who would like to ask questions could start forming a line in the middle aisle behind the microphone. So maybe you can get ready. So just to continue on that theme for a minute, I mean, I'm a great admirer of your work, Zaid, particularly because you've been able to establish and to carry your job with a tremendous amount of neutrality and credibility, something that is increasingly difficult, and especially given your identity, the multiple facets of your identity and your background. And I know, for example, that in the Arab world,
They don't
often
like me.
They don't like you. No, I mean, you know, they come under attack because they expect you, perhaps not to be as vocal about human rights that you are publishing in December that identifies a number of legal settlements on the West Bank.
It's a perfect question. When I was leaving the UN Security Council, I perhaps naively thought that what I needed to do is sort of reset the relationships that my predecessor left rather frayed. And she was very outspoken, Navi Pillay, toward the end of her term, and she was really, I mean, expressive in her denunciation of many, many countries for their human rights violations. So I thought, well, going in, you know, maybe I should sort of be rather quiet and try and reset the relationships and try and visit some of these places. And I had a lunch with her, and she said to me, look, there's only one way to do this job, and that is really to come out swinging. You just come out swinging right away. And you don't discriminate, you don't privilege any group of countries, or indeed not even your own country, certainly not. Otherwise the credibility is gone. And I think I've tried to do that. The way in which, especially in the global north, you approach human rights when it's directed toward them is really quite astonishing, because you'd be visiting countries which traditionally have been the sentinel for maintaining a universal standard or holding other countries to their obligations. And suddenly you have this Jordanian guy, and he's not Safwan Masri, he's Zeid Ra'ad, and he's asking these questions, and they feel, you know, why are you asking questions about us? We should be talking about Burundi and the DRC. But the problem is, of course, that all countries are in violation of their various treaty obligations. No country has a pristine record. And so we will applaud those who are doing better, but we will also not harbor any reservation about saying things that we need to say about those who are defaulting. Now, the key to dealing with these complex issues, I think, is to have a certain credibility. So they may all hate you for it, but if they don't see you to be discriminating, or that you're bending to the will of one of the big powers, or that you will not publish a report on Crimea because the Russian Federation will become sort of incensed, or that you shouldn't mention Louis Xiaobo's name because the Chinese government will become angry. You know, if you move in that direction, then it's very difficult to make the advocacy point. And I think, so dealing with the complex issues, of which there are many, especially in our region, right, I hope is attenuated by taking this approach.
Absolutely. If they liked you, then you should worry.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah,
you're not doing what you're supposed to do.
I suppose you're right, yeah.
Okay, so let's take the questions. If you don't mind, identify yourself and make the question and make it very brief.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you so much for coming. My name is Amir Ashur, and I'm a first-year human rights student at the Graduate School of Arts and Science. And my question is actually a build-up on Mr. Masri's first question, and that's how you've been very vocal about LGBT issues, and you've been involved with the Free and Equal campaign and so many other campaigns. How do you maintain the balance between your personal and professional views with the views of the Jordanian government, which, for example, have been vocally condemning LGBT rights and managed to shut down the only LGBT magazine in Jordan by politicians like Dima Tahboub, for example. So how do you manage to keep your freedom of speech, and what would be your advice to those in Jordan to do the same, basically?
That's right.
Exactly.
That's right.
Musical band from performing
That's right.
because its lead singer is
Yeah.
gay.
Exactly.
That's right. It's a great question. I explained this. Safwan asked me a similar question because we would, as all Jordanians do, you sit there and you discuss all the problems within the country. I told him that recently I had a meeting with the African Islamic Arab countries at the UN. And I was pushing forward this reform plan that we have for the office. So one of the ambassadors took the floor and said, High Commissioner, we will not support you. We will not support you because your promotion and protection of the rights of the LGBTI is an offense to many African and Islamic countries, and so we will not support what you are trying to do. So very quickly I asked for the floor from the ambassador of South Africa who is chairing. And I said, I'd like to respond right away. And I looked at the ambassador and I said, look, over the last 10 days, I have been defending the rights of immigrant communities in Europe, the rights of migrants. I have singled out European leaders by name for being xenophobic and racist. And I have been so vocal in a landscape where I don't see other voices. And by the way, where do these people come from? They come from your countries. And where are you? And do you want me to stop defending their rights? Because I tell you something, the right wing in Europe also believes that they don't deserve rights. And if we start down that road, we're not going to have rights for anyone. Predictably, he came up after the meeting and said, look, I'm sorry. And But it's, the point we have to keep making time and again. If you start discriminating along one vector, you will not end. And we have to defend the human rights of everyone. And I depend on all of you to help me do this, because I cannot do it alone. We in the small office in the UN simply cannot do this alone. And we need the help of civil society, students, academics, because the stakes are so large. But thank you for raising that.
Thank you.
And thank you. You're also ideally positioned studying human rights to focus on this issue. President Bollinger mentioned in my book, anomaly. One anomaly within Tunisia is the fact that
No.
it's a great question.
Thank you. And I hope, Amir, when you graduate, hopefully with a good grade, you come and join us.
Good afternoon, Mr. the High Commissioner. My name is Harmony Kobange. I'm a first-year MIA student at SIPA studying human rights and gender. So my question is as follows. The DRC was recently elected at the Human Rights Council. Despite widespread opposition from the human rights community, including civil society on the ground, due to the widespread violations committed by the government in view of the upcoming election, as well as the unpunished human rights violation in the Kasai region, as well as in the eastern provinces. So could you please share your thoughts about that first and foremost, and tell us whether that sent the wrong message to not only leaders in the region, as well as to advocates of human rights as a whole? Thank you.
That's a great question, this. Sometimes I meet with students and it's a really pleasant exchange, but not too difficult. And at other times, it feels like I'm subjected to an advanced exam made to work. It's a great question. It's a great question because the more we think about it, and others have said this as well, if you were to go with countries, only those that are by and large holding to their obligations, you might end up with a Human Rights Council that is really just another way of saying the Nordic Council, and have Scandinavian countries there only. So having countries that violate human rights, I think, is something that we're going to have to live with. It's the gravity, the scale of it that which will require subjective judgment on the part of the countries that elect others onto the Human Rights Council. Where we really put a premium is whether the country in question on the Human Rights Council is actually working with us, cooperating with the UN, cooperating with all the human rights mechanisms. Because if it isn't, then it seems to be in breach of the very resolution that set up the composition and membership, or basically what is required for the composition and membership of the Human Rights Council. So I've spoken on this most recently in September, and said that where countries are violating and they're not cooperating, then really the membership should undertake a review, and if need be, the country should be asked to remove itself from the Human Rights Council, because it's not serious. It's not serious, and it should be. And this idea that you just window dress, sort of pay lip service to it and get away with it, is also not acceptable. Thank you for the question.
Hi, good afternoon, I think already. My name is Teresa. I'm a first-year MIA Human Rights, Gender, and Middle East student. My question actually is about, High Commissioner, you mentioned very briefly Colombia on your speech. Well, I wanted to understand a little bit what are your evaluation of the implementation of the peace accord so far, taking into account we have over 150 human rights defenders and social leaders that were assassinated over the past year and a half, a little bit more. So what's your current evaluation of this process?
Yeah, no, this is again a great question. It reminds me of a press conference a few weeks ago.
Well, I was a journalist.
We are worried, exactly for the point that you raised, that we felt that once the FARC EP were moved out of their the areas, the coca growing areas, and we didn't have, or the Colombian government didn't put in place very quickly crop substitution strategies, alternative economies. It was only a matter of time before others would begin vying for that business model. And we would see then the very sorts of things that we are seeing now, attacks or assassinations of human rights defenders in the form that you've just described. So we are working with the Colombian government, or trying to convince them to move more quickly. The Colombian people have enormous talent. I mean, I've never come across a country with so many lawyers, and really good lawyers. I was driving to a village a year ago with the head of the victims unit, someone who had been taken hostage by the FARC and was kept hostage for about 8 years. And he said to me, in Colombia, we believe, why keep things simple when you can make them insanely complicated? And that's seemingly what happens whenever we try and break some of these problems. Then there are issues relating to impunity, the false positives that still exist, the amnesty issues, and so we are sort of cautiously optimistic, but it requires a great deal of work.
Being conscious of time, I want to try to give as many of you an opportunity to ask questions. So if you don't mind, Zeid, we'll take 2 or 3 at a time. Actually, I see 6 people in line, so we won't take anybody else in line. If we can take 3 at a time, perfect. And that way we'll have 2 sets, but be perfect. Very quick if you don't mind, and go in succession, you gentlemen and the 2 women behind you.
Of course. Hi, Commissioner. Thank you very much. It's an honor to have you here. My name is Daniel Berezowski. I'm an MIA student at SIPA and concentrating in human rights. You mentioned Libya at the beginning of your talk, and I was wondering what your thoughts are on the effectiveness of R2P, the R2P doctrine. And should we be asking the countries that evoke R2P to at least ratify all international human rights treaties before they can evoke R2P?
And you'll explain what it is, right?
Hi, my name is Irina Karkanis, and I'm a first-year human rights student at Columbia College. The United Nations has recently called the persecution of Rohingya Muslims as a textbook example of ethnic cleansing. However, Myanmar leader herself, Aung San Suu Kyi, has said that ethnic cleansing is too strong a term. As a diplomat and a human rights advocate, what are the consequences of her silence in this matter, and what should we as an international community do in place of that?
Hi, my name is Soraya. I study Middle Eastern Studies, Film, and Anthropology, but I also work on entrepreneurship with refugees and reconstruction in post-conflict zones. So I wanted to know, what is your advice for young entrepreneurs, or if you know of any resources for young entrepreneurs working in human rights, applications of technology?
Great. So we've got Libya, R2P, Rohingya, and social entrepreneurship.
Oh, they're great questions. All right, so the first one, Libya and R2P. So the right to protect emerged from the experiences of the 1990s, I'm sorry. And in the late 1990s, a number of countries, in Canada, Australia, Gareth Evans, the former foreign minister of Australia, and I think he was affiliated with Colombia, began this creating a sort of normative framework for states to use different methods early on in a crisis to ensure that repressive or regimes that are turning in on their people basically are prevented from doing so through a series of mediation efforts and so forth. But ultimately, perhaps the question was also posed that there should be some form of intervention. In 2005, there was a backlash against this by those states who believed really it was all about intervention. It wasn't about finding through mediation a solution to these problems. Partly because of course, the Iraq adventure in 2002, 2003, and so since then there still has remained this discussion. We believe that it is extremely important. We believe that the exits are very evident at the beginning of a crisis and disappear as the crisis prolongs. If we don't have a meaningful discussion about what combination of different elements we can use, leverage, enticements, inducements to prevent a clash where excessive use of force is used by the security forces in the first instance, potentially leading to widespread violations of other forms, torture, enforced disappearances, and ultimately a full-scale collapse, as we saw in Syria or in Libya, then we save ourselves and the regions and the people in question immense suffering. But we're still not there yet. The effort required requires further. The effort required is enormous, and it invites us to invest more. And my former colleague, Ivan Shimonovich, is actually working here in Colombia on R2P, and we fully support their efforts. It's something that still requires our help.
Can you answer the other two in 1 minute?
Yeah, okay. So the Rohingya. Look, I'm very unhappy, given what I have seen in ASEAN, at the ASEAN summit. I haven't seen the records of all the statements. I haven't seen the final communique, but the initial draft communique and what I've seen on the news, the fact that many world leaders have eschewed even using the term Rohingya after what they've suffered. I mean, how much more do they need to suffer before they're recognized by some of these leaders? It's very, very disappointing. And you really have to ask the question of what's becoming of us. Aung San Suu Kyi, I'm hugely disappointed in her. After what we consider to be the dry run of last year, where there was an attack on a border post in October, and then there was a smaller scale version of what we're seeing now, we produced a report on the basis of an investigation, and I spoke to her, and I appealed to her to use all her emotional standing and moral standing inside the country to confront the military and put an end to this. Evidently, she was unable to do that. And now she speaks in compassionate terms, and I hope that they're sincere. She visited northern Rakhine, which I thought was good, but I only wished it had happened a year and a half ago and not now. We still have to put an end to what we are seeing in place, and these people have to be invited back. I fear it's never going to happen simply because the operations were so systematic, so organized, so well planned that there was there was intent involved. And so I believe it rises to the threshold of very serious violations, international crimes. As you know, ethnic cleansing is not a defined offense, but it conveys forcible displacement. But there was also physical destruction on quite a massive scale. So it's a trauma. Finally, the last point. If we allow this to happen at zero cost, and this ASEAN summit seemingly was moving in that direction, how many other countries with minorities would be only too willing, if they want to remove a so-called problem from their society, follow suit in the same way? And then again, we open ourselves to enormous turmoil.
You know, we're out of time, but I promised them, so 5 seconds per question, very quickly, and then you'll maybe answer them very, very quickly. Yes.
Okay, I will try to reword my question really fast, but my name is Madiha Zahra. I am doing a master's in human rights and concentrating in exactly what you spoke about today. So my question is, what relationship can or do the big companies in Silicon Valley play in helping realize the Sustainable Development Goals? What recommendations have they made to your office?
Great, thank you.
Hello, my name is Jiyoung Kim. I'm a first-year MI student at SIPA, concentrating on human rights and humanitarian policy. My question is, how fast is the UN adopting technology and the use of data to solve problems in human rights, humanitarian, and peacekeeping?
Great.
Hi, my name is Gacy. I'm going directly to my question. One, how can we hold Pakistan's government accountable to support Taliban in Afghanistan? And also, how can we help the Afghan government to have more women in the peace negotiation with the Taliban, if you think the peace negotiation is a solution to have peace in Afghanistan?
Thank you. So high-tech, Silicon Valley, Afghanistan.
Well, I'll do the high-tech very quickly and social entrepreneurship.
Because the first two questions can be combined, perhaps.
So when I was at Stanford, I met with a large number of coders and computer scientists. What struck me is that they were all thirsty for knowing more about values, rights, universal principles. They were all disposed in that direction. And as you know, many of the tech companies, much of the creativity actually occurs in universities, and the tech companies then buy up these startups that emerge from universities. So we need to work with university students and engineers on these human rights issues, and I think that's a good starting point. The SDGs leave no one behind. We can't do it unless you deal with discrimination, systematic discrimination. If we don't deal with that part of development, there's no way we can do this. I mean, I'll give you an example. We were discussing at the World Economic Forum. Someone mentioned about the great work being done for women in India without qualifying which state, whether they were urban, rural, and so forth. And so I raised the question, does this involve Dalit women? Which women? Who are we talking about? If it's just the privileged, we can see great progress in urban settings, certain areas. But if it's those who are marginalized to begin with, the picture is very different. The SDGs are impossible to conceive of as a success, especially 1 through to 8, 10, and 16, if we don't have human rights at the core. And then finally, tech, UN, how fast? Not fast at all. We're hopeless in this area. And I'm sure someone would tell me that I shouldn't be saying that as a senior UN official. But it's the case. It's absolutely hopeless. And the last one, Pakistan, we have a very serious channel that we've opened with Pakistan on a whole range of issues within the country. It's enormously complex. On some of the issues, we feel there is a useful dialogue. On others, we're not there yet. But it's, those countries, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, the countries of the subcontinent, all of them need a strong interaction with us. And we need to work with them because the problems are quite enormous in human rights terms there.
Before I thank you, I really want to thank the students. You are incredible, and the questions have really been wonderful. And I want to thank our president, Lee Bollinger, for making this possible and for making all of these kinds of conversations possible. I guarantee you that you will not have or will get this kind of engagement, this kind of interaction on any other campus in this country. Zeid, not only thank you for sharing of your time and insights, but thank you for all the great work that you do on all of our behalves. And we look forward to what happens next. And with the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration, I know that that's a big focus, and that's an opportunity that you're going to be using to reinforce many of the issues that you're working on.
Yeah, and please, for the 70th anniversary, we want to celebrate the Universal Declaration in 2018, but we must realize that this is a bare-knuckled fight for rights now. We are now having to brawl for our rights. The assumption that we can just, on a scholarly level, conduct an easy negotiation with the duty bearers, the countries, the governments concerned, I think we've gone past that. We have to recognize that we all have something to lose, and that 100 million people, if you include those who died in the influenza outbreak in 1918, died, or rather it was the energy from their death that, in the negative sense, that produced the UDHR and the human rights mechanisms we have in place. If we lose it, and we could lose it, we're not going to be able to stitch it back together again. So we can't lose it, and we need all of you to help and support us. And please join us for the campaign next year. Thank you.
Thank you, Zeid. Thank you. Really, thank you so much.